The morning Dale Mussig finally went quiet had been coming for more than 20 years, and it arrived the way most important things do in Cass County, Nebraska, without announcement in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, with a smell of dried corn dust hanging in the air and a fluorescent tube overhead flickering in its housing the way it always had. It was January 2020, and Clyde Hartley had driven over from the elevator office with a folder tucked under his arm and a look on his face that was not quite satisfaction and not quite pity, but somewhere between the two. He set the folder on the co-op counter, opened it to the first page, and laid 3 separate forward contract records side by side. 3 years, 3 separate growing seasons. Corn contracted 6 months before harvest, at prices that turned out to be higher than the price the market delivered at the bin. Dale stood behind the counter and looked at those records for a long time. Hank Ford was standing on the far side of that counter wearing the same Carhartt barn coat she had worn through most of 2 decades, the zipper replaced twice, and the left elbow worn pale from resting against truck windows on long drives out to the fields. She was 61 years old, and she had not said a word since she came through the door. She did not say one now. Let me tell you how she got to that counter, because the walk took 22 years, and every step of it matters. Hank inherited the 480 acres in September of 1998, when her mother, Ruth Ford, died of a heart attack at 67. Still farming, still keeping records, still doing the things she had done since the early 1970s, without ever explaining it to anyone who did not already understand it. Ruth had not been a talker. Neither was Hank. The farm passed to her in the will without ceremony, and Hank drove down from Lincoln, where she had been working as a seed counter at an ag cooperative, loaded the last of her clothes into a bag, and moved back to the house she had grown up in before the end of October. The kitchen was as Ruth had left it. Dishes stacked the same way, coffee can on the left side of the counter, the calendar from the Farmers' Co-op of Plattsmouth still showing September, because nobody had thought to turn the page. Hank opened the junk drawer beside the stove to look for a pen, and found, underneath a rubber band ball and a spare key she could not identify, a spiral-bound notebook. Not particularly old-looking. Blue cover, wire spiral, Ruth's handwriting in ballpoint pen on the first page. She read it standing at the counter with her coat still on. Yeah, it was a grain marketing log. Ruth had kept it every year since 1974. Each entry followed the same form. The February date, the projected bushel yield for that year, the contract price she had locked in for 70% of projected production, and then, at the end of the growing season, the actual harvest spot price the elevator was paying. The numbers were Ruth's witness. In most years, the contract price she had locked in the previous winter sat above what the market paid at harvest. Not every year, but most of them. And in the years when harvest prices came in above her contracts, Ruth had noted that too, plainly, without complaint. She had left 30% uncontracted every year, and that 30% caught the upside when it came. Hank turned to the last filled page, the entry for 1997. February contract, $2.65 per bushel on corn. Harvest spot, $2.31. She closed the notebook and held it against her chest for a moment the way someone holds a hat in church. Then she opened the kitchen drawer again and put it back. She found the pen she had been looking for. She turned the calendar to October. That was September 1998. She planted her first spring crop as the operator of the Ford place in 1999, and in February of 1999, she called the elevator and contracted 70% of her projected yield the way Ruth had done for 25 years. She did this without telling anyone she was doing it, because Ruth had not told anyone either, and because nobody had asked. Here is where Dale Mussig enters the story. And let me be fair to the man, because he was not a bad person. He was a good-natured, thick-shouldered co-op manager who had been right about most things most of the time, and who had a way of talking at the counter that made everyone within earshot feel he was personally looking out for him. He had known Ruth Ford, and he knew Hank by extension, and he had the specific warmth of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything, and therefore never developed a habit of questioning himself. In the spring of 1999, when word got out that Hank had already contracted most of her corn before she had even finished planting it, Dale laughed at the co-op counter in front of 4 other farmers and called it, in exactly those words, a heck of a way to leave money on the table, sweetheart. The 4 farmers laughed too. The way farmers laugh at something they are not entirely sure is funny. Hank was not at the counter when he said it. She heard about it later from the man who sold her propane, who thought she should know. She nodded and drove home, and that was the last time she thought about it for several months. She farmed the 480 acres through the early 2000s with care and without debt. The mortgage on the equipment had been paid off by Ruth, and the land itself was free and clear, which meant that every year Hank needed to cover was an operating year only. Fuel, seed, chemicals, property tax, and the repair bills on machinery that was older than it looked. The old combine was a mid-1980s model she kept running with parts she sourced from a salvage yard in Weeping Water, and the planter was the same one Ruth had bought new in 1981. She replaced the bearings herself on the shop floor, with a shop manual propped against a toolbox and a drop light hung from the rafters. There was a morning in March of 2003 worth describing, because it carried the texture of those years better than the summary does. Hank was up at 5:40 and out at the shop by 6, with a thermos of coffee and a list she had written on the back of an envelope the night before. The list said, replace bearings on row units 2 and 4, reset depth gauge on row unit 3, oil the parallel arm pivots, check the seed tube on row unit 5 for wear. The planter was on a roll of cardboard at the center of the shop floor with the row units exposed. She had ordered the bearings through a parts catalog in February, paid $48 for the set, and they had come in the previous Wednesday in a small white box that was on the workbench behind her. Roy Fenwick stopped by at 7:30 on his way back from town, with a sack of seed corn for his own operation. He saw the shop light on, and pulled into the yard and came in through the side door. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the planter on the floor for a moment. Bearings, Roy said. 2 and 4, Hank said. Roy nodded. He stepped over the cord on the drop light and stood beside her looking at the row unit she had open. He was a friendly man. He looked at the seed meter housing and the chain drive and the parallel arm linkage, and he asked her how old the planter was, and she said 1981. He shook his head with something that was not quite admiration and not quite disagreement. He said, I had a 6-row that age once. Traded it in 98 for the John Deere I'm running now. Hank said, I remember. Note's still got 4 years on it, Roy said. He said it the way a man says something out loud to confirm what he already knew. He stayed for 10 minutes. Hank went back to the bearing while he stood there, fitting the new race into the housing, lining up the seal, checking the play with her thumb. She did not stop work to talk, and Roy did not seem to need her to. Before he left, he said, You ever think about updating the planter? Hank said, I think about it every March when I'm on the floor with it. Roy laughed. He said, And then? Then I finish the bearing, Hank said. Roy nodded again. He left the shop and got in his pickup and drove home. The bearing job took her 3 hours that morning, including the depth gauge reset, and the seed tube replacement on row Unit 5. The total parts cost on the morning's work was $57.40. She wrote it on a folded sheet of paper she kept in the shop for repair records, the same kind of running tally Ruth had kept, in pencil, with the date and the part number and the cost. She washed the grease off her hands at the shop sink, refilled the thermos at the kitchen, and went out to start fertilizer hauling on the South 40. The afternoon ran into evening without trouble. The discipline was simple, and it did not vary. In January or February each year, she pulled out her mother's notebook and opened it to the last entry, then opened a new page and wrote the date. She called Clyde at the elevator, got a February price quote on corn futures. And if the number was anywhere near what she thought she needed for the year, she contracted 70% of projected yield. She left 30% open. She closed the notebook and went back to work. Roy Fenwick had the 640-acre operation directly to the north, past the tree row and the stock pond that had been there since both their grandfathers' time. He was a careful man in his own way, and a friendly one, and the two of them got along the way neighbors get along when neither one causes the other trouble. Roy ran conventional. He planted when the extension service said to plant, sprayed what the sales rep recommended, sold at harvest when he could get to the elevator before dark. He had a new cab-over tractor by 2001, and a new planter by 2003, and a new combine by 2006. And each of those purchases sat on a note at the ag lender in Plattsmouth. He was not reckless. He was ordinary. He was doing what the lender encouraged, what the equipment dealer encouraged, what every field day and every co-op meeting and every agronomist's recommendation said a growth-oriented operation looked like. He was farming the way farming looked in magazines. Hank was farming the way her mother had farmed, without explaining herself. 2008 arrived and changed the terms of that difference. In February 2008, corn futures were running high. The ethanol expansion had been eating into corn supplies for 2 years, and the market was behaving the way it behaves when people are convinced something important has changed forever. Hank called Clyde at the elevator on the 8th of February. The February price on December futures was $4.10 per bushel. She contracted 70% of her projected 480-acre yield at that price, which came to approximately 56,000 bushels committed. She hung up and wrote the number in Ruth's notebook. $4.10, February 8th. By October of that year, the harvest spot price had fallen to $3.20 per bushel. What went up had come down. She delivered her contracted bushels at $4.10. She delivered the remaining 30% at whatever the elevator was paying that week, which was $3.20. Her blended price for the year was somewhere around $3.87 per bushel, and she went home and wrote that in the notebook too. The market had not cooperated with the people who waited. Roy had sold at harvest and taken $3.20 across his whole crop. It was not a disaster for him because his yields had been good, but it was not what February had promised, and the note on the new combine did not get smaller because the price fell. At the co-op that October, while farmers were comparing harvest notes the way farmers do, Dale made a point of mentioning that anyone who had sold forward at $4.10 and watched the market fall was sitting pretty right now. He said it in the general direction of the room. Hank was at the counter buying a replacement hydraulic fitting. Dale looked over at her and said, "Well, Hank, I guess your mother taught you something after all, even if you did cut yourself out of the rest of the run." She picked up her bag and said the run ended in October, Dale. She walked out. The other farmers did not laugh this time. This was the first time Dale was publicly wrong in a specific and nameable way. He had been wrong before in the smaller, unmemorable way that everyone is wrong from time to time. But this was the first time the numbers were on the counter between them, and the numbers were not his. Let me tell you about Roy's expansion, because it matters to what came later, and it was happening the same year as all of this. Roy bought 460 additional acres that fall from the Blinker estate, which brought him to 1,100 acres total. He financed the land purchase and carried it alongside his equipment notes. The per-acre price was not unreasonable by 2008 standards, and the lender in Plattsmouth was comfortable with the debt-to-asset ratio because land prices had been climbing since 2004, and nobody in the room believed they would stop. Roy was now a substantial operator by Cass County standards, and he had the equipment to prove it. Hank drove past his new ground on the way back from the elevator and noted it without saying anything to anyone. 4 years passed. The weather changed. The drought of 2012 was not the kind that came on a single day. It came the way droughts always come in Nebraska, which is slowly, by degrees, through a spring that was too warm and a June that was too dry and a July that became something to talk about for a long time. By midsummer, corn that should have been chest high was tasseling early at waist height, which is what corn does when it is trying to finish before it dies. Hank had contracted in February, as she always did. The February 2012 price on December corn futures had been $6.80 per bushel, pushed up by the memory of 2008 and the continued pressure of ethanol demand, and a market that had not yet seen the summer coming. She contracted 70% of projected yield at that price, which assumed an average corn year. The year was not average. She took the drought yield, which was reduced, and delivered her contracted bushels at $6.80. The harvest spot price had climbed during the drought months, as it always does when there is less corn to buy, but it had not climbed as high as people assumed it would. The elevator in Plattsmouth was paying $5.90 by harvest, which was a drought year number that felt good in isolation, and was still 90 cents per bushel below what Hank had locked in February, when nobody knew what July would bring. Her 30% uncontracted bushels sold at $5.90, but 70% had already been sold at $6.80. She wrote the numbers in Ruth's notebook and went inside and made coffee and did not speak about it. Roy had contracted nothing forward. He delivered everything at the elevator in October at $5.90 per bushel. His yield was also reduced by the drought, which meant he delivered fewer bushels than normal at a price that was below what the market had offered in February. He made the note payments and carried forward. He told Dale at the co-op that next year he was going to think more carefully about marketing, and Dale agreed that the drought had been hard on everyone, and both men seemed to understand the drought as the cause of the problem, rather than the demonstration of a different one. Dale had said something in August, when the drought was visible, and the spot price was climbing. He was at the co-op counter when a group of farmers came in from checking on their crops, and Dale had leaned over and told the room that anyone who had sold forward at winter prices was missing the drought rally. He said it as something to feel bad about, the way you might mention that someone had left a good hand of cards face down on the table. Hank was not in the room. A neighbor's hired man was, and he told her about it the following week. She did not reply. The drought rally ended in November, when the November estimate came in, and the market decided the crop was smaller, but not small enough to sustain those prices. Dale did not revisit the August comment. He was a man who lived in the current moment of the market, and the current moment was always something else by the time anyone thought to check. If you have been watching this channel a while, you probably know where this is going. The pattern was 2 years old by 2012, and it was not yet visible to anyone who was not keeping Ruth Ford's notebook. Drop a comment below if you grew up around forward contracting. I am curious how many people came to this the same way Hank did, through someone else's handwriting in a kitchen drawer. 5 more years passed. Roy borrowed more. The market ran and stumbled and ran again, and the land prices in Cass County stayed high enough that nobody at the ag lender's office was worried about collateral. Vera had come home from college by 2015. She had studied agronomy at the University of Nebraska and arrived back at the Ford place with a laptop and an opinion about variable rate seeding, and a politely skeptical attitude toward her mother's marketing approach. She did not say it was wrong. She said it was simple. She said she had learned about more sophisticated hedging strategies and option contract overlays and the basis risk profiles of different elevator regions. Hank listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "Your grandfather bought this land in 1952. Your grandmother planted it. Your mother paid it off. I have 480 acres with no debt and money in the bank. Tell me more about sophisticated." Vera thought about that for a while and then said, "All right, show me the notebook." Hank got it from the kitchen drawer and set it on the table, and Vera read it, start to finish. Ruth's entries in the front, Hank's entries beginning in 1999 in the same deliberate hand. When Vera got to the end, she sat quietly for a moment, and then she asked if she could start keeping the records on a spreadsheet so they were easier to track. Hank said she could keep them any way she liked as long as she also kept them in the notebook. Vera became the records keeper. She sat in on the February phone call to Clyde starting in 2016. She pulled the USDA NASS historical price data and built a table showing what the harvest spot price had been in each of the years her mother had contracted forward. She did not say what the table showed. She put it in the folder with the contracts and filed it with the other records and brought the notebook back to the kitchen drawer. February 2017. Hank called Clyde. December corn futures were at $3.95 per bushel, which was a modest number, a working number, the kind of number that makes a careful farmer think about whether to contract or wait. Corn had been cheap since 2014. The market was not exciting, and the agronomists at the university were not calling for a major rally, and the basis in Cass County was close to ordinary. She contracted 70% of projected yield at $3.95 and wrote the number in the notebook. At the co-op counter in March, after word circulated that Hank had already contracted for the year, Dale said something he would spend the next 3 years thinking about. He was talking to Roy and 2 other farmers, and he said, in a voice that carried to the door, "I respect what Hank does. I just don't know why you'd lock in $3.95 on a market that hasn't found its bottom yet." He shook his head with something that looked like genuine concern. He said, "Someday that's going to cost her." Roy nodded. He was at $3.95 himself in his head, but he had not contracted it because he was waiting for $4, which the market did not deliver that spring. Hank heard this version of the story from the propane man again, who seemed to make a habit of informing her. She was in the shop replacing a spindle bearing on the planter when he told her, and she kept her hands on the bearing while he talked, and she thanked him when he finished and went back to work. Here is where I want to tell you about the private doubt, because the notebook does not record it, but Vera saw it, and she remembered it later. It was June of 2017, a Wednesday night, And the June USDA crop report had come out with a projection that suggested tighter than expected corn supplies going into fall. The market bumped. By Thursday morning, December corn futures had moved to $4.15. Hank's contracted price was $3.95. If the market held, she had locked 70% of her crop at 20 cents per bushel below where the futures were sitting that morning. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee for a long time, looking at the fields, and did not say anything. Vera came downstairs and saw her standing there, and did not say anything either, because she understood enough by then to know when to be quiet. Hank turned from the window after a while and said, "The harvest price is not the June price." Vera said, "No, it's not." The June price did not hold. By September, the corn market had softened as the crop came in larger than the June projection had suggested, and by October, the elevator in Plattsmouth was posting $3.40 per bushel. That was 55 cents per bushel below Hank's contracted price, and 55 cents below what Roy delivered in October, when he finally pulled the trigger on marketing a crop he had been watching for 9 months. Hank delivered her contracted bushels at $3.95. She delivered the remaining 30% at $3.40. She wrote both numbers in the notebook. Roy called it a soft year. He had 1,100 acres, and his blended cost of production by then, including land note payments, equipment notes, and operating costs, required something close to $3.90 per bushel to break even. He delivered at $3.40. He was not the only one. Corn had been under $4 for most of 3 years, and the lenders who had been patient were beginning to have less patience. The rate spike was not a single event. It was a series of Federal Reserve moves beginning in late 2017 and running through 2018 that raised short-term borrowing costs faster than most operating loan structures could absorb. An operating loan that had been carrying at 4% in 2016 was carrying at 6.5% by late 2018. Roy's lender in Plattsmouth had been reviewing his file quarterly since the 2017 harvest. They reviewed it one more time in the spring of 2019. The letter arrived at Roy's farm in March of 2019. It was not unexpected, which made it worse. He had known the conversation was coming since fall. The lender's position was straightforward. The collateral had not kept pace with the accumulated debt, corn prices had not recovered, and the operating loan could not be renewed at its current level. They would work with him on the land, but 320 of his 1,100 acres would need to be liquidated. Roy sat at his kitchen table and read the letter twice. He called his wife in from the other room. He did not say anything for a while after she read it. The auction was in June of 2019. Roy's equipment did not go on the block because the lender was working with him on restructuring the equipment notes, but the 320 acres went to auction and sold at $6,200 per acre to a farmland investment company from Omaha that did not grow anything on it and leased it back to Roy at a market rate that ate most of what the yield would have earned. Hank drove to the auction the way she drove everywhere, without announcing herself. She stood at the back of the tent and watched the 320 acres sell in 2 parcels. She saw Roy standing near the front, hands in his pockets, not talking to anyone. She did not approach him. She drove home. She had 480 acres. She owed nothing on any of them. The summer of 2019 and into the fall, the conversations at the co-op changed register. There had been 6 other foreclosure auctions in the county that year, and 3 more operating loan restructurings that farmers talked about in the co-op parking lot the way they used to talk about machinery breakdowns. The specifics were different. The cause was more or less the same. Corn was cheap, rates were high, land that had been bought at peak prices was not generating enough revenue to service the debt attached to it. Dale watched all of this from behind the co-op counter with the expression of a man who had been recommending a restaurant that turned out to have a health violation. He had not told anyone to overextend. He had not told Roy to buy those 460 acres. He had simply never made a sustained argument against it, and there is a kind of harm that lives in the absence of argument. Dale understood this in a low, inarticulate way by the fall of 2019, and it showed in the quiet around his comments. Clyde Hartley had been watching the forward contract records at the elevator for years. He was not an excitable man, and he did not dramatize what he noticed, but he was methodical, and the records were his records, and he knew what was in them. By January of 2020, he had pulled Hank's contract history for 2008, 2012, and 2017, and laid the 3 sheets side by side on his desk and looked at them for a while. What he saw was not complicated. In 2008, she had contracted at $4.10, when the harvest came in at $3.20. In 2012, she had contracted at $6.80 when the harvest came in at $5.90. In 2017, she had contracted at $3.95 when the harvest came in at $3.40. 3 consecutive forward contract years. 3 consecutive years of contracting above what the market paid at harvest. The gap ranged from 55 cents to 90 cents per bushel across those 3 years, and against 70% of projected yield on 480 acres, that was a material difference across each growing season. Clyde put the 3 sheets in a folder. He drove over to the co-op on a Tuesday morning in January, because that was where the farmers gathered, and because he thought it was worth saying something directly where the dismissals had been public. He set the folder on the counter and opened it, and he laid the 3 records out. And he looked at Dale, and he said, "I want to show you something about Hank Ford's marketing record." Dale looked at the papers. Hank had come in to buy a fuel filter. She was standing to the left of Clyde with the filter in her hand, still in its package. Because she had been there when Clyde arrived and neither of them had planned the timing, it had just worked out that way. 3 other farmers were in the room. The propane man was one of them. He stood near the door and did not say anything, and he would not need to relay anything to Hank afterward, because she was already there. Dale looked at the 3 sheets for a long time. He was not a man who liked to be wrong. He was also not a man who would refuse what the numbers showed, and what the numbers showed was not ambiguous. He said, finally, that he had not realized she had done it 3 years in a row. Clyde said 3 consecutive, 8, 12, and 17. Dale looked at Hank. He said, "How do you decide when to contract?" She set the fuel filter on the counter. She looked at him for a moment and then said, "In February, when the price is where it needs to be." He said, "How do you know what price you need?" She said, "I know what it costs to farm the ground. I contract what I need to cover it and leave the rest alone." Dale nodded. He picked up the first contract sheet and looked at the February date. February 8th, 2008. He set it down. He said, "Your mother did it this way too, didn't she?" Hank said she did. He said, "I should have paid closer attention." She said, "You can start now." She picked up the fuel filter, paid for it, and walked out. The 3 farmers who had been in the room did not follow her out. They stood around the counter with Clyde and Dale and looked at the contract records and talked about what it meant to sell grain you had not yet grown, which was a conversation that should have started earlier and did not because nobody had made enough noise about it, in a room where noise is the currency. Dale kept the 3 contract sheets on the counter for the rest of the day. He made copies. He pinned one to the bulletin board behind the counter near the seed company flyers, where it stayed for the better part of 2 years. Hank did not come back to the co-op that day. She drove home on the county road, past Roy's reduced operation, past the North Tree Row and the stock pond, and pulled into the yard and went to work in the shop on a hydraulic seal she had been meaning to replace for 2 weeks. Vera called that evening. She had heard from the propane man who had apparently updated his communication habits for the new decade and was now using a cell phone to pass along information in real time. Vera said, "I hear it went well." Hank said, "Clyde did most of it." Vera said, "You going to tell me what you said?" Hank said, "I told him February and what it cost to farm the ground." There was a silence on the phone. Vera said, "That's it?" Hank said, "That's all there is to it. This is the other thing I want you to know, because the co-op scene was not the end of the story, only the end of that particular argument." By 2022, Vera had been keeping the records for 6 years and running the variable rate seeding trials on the South 40 and learning the ground the way you can only learn it by walking it in boots that get muddy. She had her mother's patience, which she had not always known she had. She had the spreadsheet and the notebook and the USDA price table, and she had watched the 2019 auction from the road because her mother had not said she could not come. In the spring of 2022, Hank called her into the kitchen after supper and put an envelope on the table. Inside was a lease agreement for 160 acres of the South ground, below market rate. First option to buy when Vera was ready, and a handwritten note for $40,000, no interest, to cover Vera's first-year operating costs on her own rotation. Vera read the lease and the note and held them together the way her mother had held the notebook in 1998. She did not cry, but her eyes did a thing that meant the same. She said, "Mom, this is too much." Hank said, "It's what the operation can afford. And you've earned the start." Vera said, "What do I do first?" Hank stood up and went to the kitchen drawer. She opened it and took out the blue spiral notebook and set it on the table in front of her daughter. She said, "Read it start to finish. Then write this February's entry in the back." Vera looked at the notebook for a moment. She said, "What's the February price looking like?" Hank said she'd have to call Clyde to find out. Vera smiled. She pulled the notebook toward her. The 480 acres stayed in the family. No debt on a square foot of it. The old combine was retired 2 winters later and replaced by one that was 15 years newer and still not new, sourced from an estate in Lancaster County at an auction where the person doing the buying was not in debt and the person doing the selling was. Roy kept 780 of his 1,100 acres, restructured, and went forward. He and Hank did not speak directly about what had happened. The way you do not speak directly about a hard winter once the ground is thawed. He started contracting forward in 2021, 50% of projected yield, and he told the propane man he wished he had started sooner. Dale Mussig retired from the co-op in 2023. At his retirement gathering, which was held at the co-op on a Saturday morning with coffee and a sheet cake from the bakery in Plattsmouth, he told the assembled farmers that the best thing he had seen in 25 years behind that counter was a woman with a blue notebook and a February phone call, and that he had taken too long to say so. Hank was at the gathering. She was standing near the coffee urn with her coat on, because the building never warmed up the way it should in March. She did not say anything to that. She poured her coffee and nodded at him across the room, and he nodded back, and they understood each other well enough. That was the end of what needed to be said between them. A nod is enough when the numbers have already done the talking. The kitchen drawer is the same drawer it has always been, in the same farmhouse on the same 480 acres that Ruth Ford paid for and Hank Ford kept. The blue notebook is not in it anymore because Vera has it now, at her own kitchen table, in the house she has been renting 2 miles south while she saves the down payment to exercise her first option on the 160. On the last Friday of each January or the first Friday of each February, Vera calls Clyde at the elevator and asks about December futures. She writes the price in the notebook the way Ruth wrote it, and the way Hank wrote it after her. She contracts 70% of projected yield if the price is where it needs to be. She leaves 30% open. She learned the number the same way the number was always learned in that family, which was from a notebook kept by someone who loved the land enough to pay attention to it in February, long before anyone could see what kind of year it was going to be. Some debts you pay in February. The other kind you are still paying in October.